Today's topic is discourse analysis, and I will be posting these slides on Blackboard, of course, as always. Okay, so discourse analysis is our chapter 4 today, and what we have is basically 3 different kinds of approaches to discourse analysis that your textbook goes over in some detail. So first we have conversation analysis, which is just abbreviated with the acronym CA, conversation analysis. That's a very common acronym used in linguistics texts, articles, and so on. Then we have interactional sociolinguistics, and this is when we've been talking about pragmatics. Last time we talked about crisis maxims and how people interact with each other, and that is the focus of interactional sociolinguistics. So and we'll look at what the differences and the similarities between these 3 different approaches. And then the third approach is the newest one. It's the Critical Discourse Analysis, abbreviated as CDA, Critical Discourse Analysis. So let's look at them one at a time, starting from CA, conversation analysis. This is based on ethnomethodology. We talked about that. It was one of the topics for, I believe, chapter 9. So you're already familiar with that. And basically we're interested in what language tells about what is going on in this particular society, very fitting to sociolinguistics. So conversation analysis. The initial point of people who started doing conversation analysis was to underscore that unplanned speech is not unorganized speech. Like when in my introduction to crisis maxims last time, I was talking about how Grice wanted to show that yes, grammar has rules, but so does discourse. It's not random, even though we are not really aware of the rules of discourse until something goes wrong, and then we are like, okay, there must have been a rule that this person or I or whoever was part of that interaction now broke. So a breaking of a conversational rule is an indication that that there is a rule, because we feel uncomfortable. Unwritten rules, unspoken rules, just subconsciously we are somehow aware of these. Like who starts the conversation, for instance, who can finish a conversation, say, okay, we're done, bye, and who can initiate those things, and who is entitled to talk more, who is entitled to talk on command. Like, for instance, if I ask a question, then it would be odd if you didn't answer. So we have these adjacency pairs, like question and answer, and this is all kind of organized. And question and answer pairs are not the only ones. Your book lists others, among them greetings. Like if I say, hi, how are you? That is not really a question, it's a greeting. It requires the second part for that adjacency pair. Otherwise it's not, complete. Because there's this rule that if you say the first part of an adjacency pair, there's got to be the second part. So people have looked at this in more detail and found that there are not only adjacency pairs, but these sequences where you have the initiation of this exchange, short exchange, a response, and then some kind of feedback. And this has been said to apply to, for instance, classroom interactions, where the teacher's initiation is basically the teacher asks a question, student responds, and then it would be odd if nothing were said or done after the student gives the response. So there's this very short feedback, like the teacher can say, yep, that's it, that's correct, or just like I remember we were specifically taught when I was in teacher training that you don't always have to say yes, or you are right, that's correct. You can just nod and send that message to the student, and that way you are not hogging even more of the conversational floor, because teachers tend to do that. So this is such a common sequence in interactions that it has gotten this acronym IRF, Initiation Response Feedback Sequence. So sometimes we have these pre-sequences to certain interactions, conversational interactions, and it would be odd if there were no pre-sequence. So you kind of like frame what you're going to be doing, like for instance, let me ask you a question, or something when the phone rings, that's in a way that's the first part of the adjacency pair, but it's also kind of like, part of the pre-sequence that before you get there, but this it can be used in a very technical sense. And on your in your book on page 286 there is an exploration about pre-sequences. If you want to take a look at that, closings are not the only speech acts that speakers may feel the need to work up to, which have like a pre-sequence to a closing, like you're on a phone and you say, okay. So that is a pre-sequence to the closing of the phone conversation. Or you say, oh, it was so nice to talk with you. That means that you're not stopping immediately, but you're starting. That's a pre-sequence to the closing. But then if there's an invitation or a request, those can have these pre-request or pre-invitations as pre-sequences. Like, can I ask you for a favor? Is a pre-sequence, like if you need to ask a person to loan the book or write a letter of recommendation or lend you $5 or whatever. Can I ask you for a favor, or do something for you, do something else for you? Here's an interesting one. Are you doing anything Saturday night? What is that a pre-sequence for? What do you think?
They want to ask you to do something with them.
Exactly. Yes. So this is also it kind of ties together with the face saving things. You want to save your positive face and the other person's positive face or negative face. In that case, your positive face and the other person's negative face. So because it's intruding the other person. If you want to come to the movies with me. So you don't immediately say, come to the movies with me, which would be very direct. So you're like, are you doing anything special on Saturday night? And that way you allow the person in these, split seconds to come up with a really perfectly good excuse if that person doesn't want to do anything with you. Because we know what it means that something, an invitation, will follow. It's just a pre-sequence to it. And it also allows you then to save face, your own face, because you're not rejected. We're very afraid of being rejected. Some people more so than others, but it always kind of like is a potential face losing situation. And that way you're not like really imposing on that person so much, because you're just clearing the space for a denial, a rejection. And then, whatever the person says, oh, I'm sorry, I'm already doing something. But if the person says, to the question, are you doing anything Saturday night? And the answer is, I'm washing my hair. What would that mean?
Well, unless they have a really long hair washing routine, it means they're rejecting you.
It's not like I'm not interested in doing anything with you. I'd rather wash my hair than. So it is a weird. It would be like a weird rejection. But anyway, so these are pre-sequences. We have openings and we have closings in certain conversational interactions. And that means that if an opening is missing, if a closing is missing, it's kind of weird. A lot of attention has been paid to telephone conversations, and we'll be looking at some telephone conversations as a matter of an example. And it's really interesting. This shows that there are these rules. There is an organization for conversation. And conversation and analysts are very interested in these kinds of underlying patterns that we can see best when something goes wrong, when something is missing. So openings and study of openings and closing sequences in sequences. These episodes, that has been interesting, and then what goes in between also follows certain rules. Perhaps that turn taking is one of the issues that conversation analysts have been looking at. How do we take turns? How long does a pause need to be? When a speaker pauses, how long does that pause need to be in order for the other person to pick up the conversation and start talking? Because if the pause is too long, it's uncomfortable, right? But that also varies between cultures, so there are cultural differences like we talked about earlier. So that in our culture, we don't like to have long pauses. Also, overlapping speech is tolerated differently. Floor management, how do we manage the conversational floor? Asking questions is a very overt way of managing the conversational floor. If I want to relinquish my conversational floor, I will ask a question, and then it's your turn to talk. I'm assigning the topic, I'm assigning a person to talk. So repair strategies is also another other point that conversation analysts have studied, and that includes self-repair. If I say something that is not right and I notice it, I will say, let me take it back. Let me start all over again. So that would be self-repair. And it would be called self-initiated self-repair, if I notice it myself and correct myself. But of course, there is also other initiated repair. If I say something, if I say a wrong word, and it's obvious to you that you didn't mean to say that, I will say that, the test is on such and such a day, and you know for sure that it's a different date on the syllabus, then, excuse me, isn't it on such and such a date? So that would be other initiated repair. The other conversational partner repairs the speaker. And then I'm like, thank you, so that would be other initiated self-repair. Or if I say something and you just look puzzled and I repeat it, let me explain it a little bit more clearly, that would be also other initiated self-repair. Of course, which one do you think is more preferred, self-repair or other repair?
Self-repair?
Yes, because it's again a matter of face. That if somebody needs to constantly correct you, then, or even once, it's kind of like, you are in danger of losing your face because somebody else noticed that you made an error. But if you notice it yourself, it's less of a danger to your conversational face. So conversation analysis is embedded in ethnomethodology, and we find a lot of things by looking at these details. One of the premises of conversation analysis is that you don't go outside the text. So the methodology is, in conversation analysis, you record naturally occurring conversations. And this is what I'm asking you guys to do in this class, to record 30 minutes and then do a transcription of 1 minute. So that is basically the method for conversation analysis. But it's also some people talk about discourse analysis. So it's a cover term for conversation analysis, because discourse analysis doesn't only look at conversation. It can look at published texts, newspapers, newspaper items, film, language in films, and so on and so forth. So it covers more ground, but it includes also, in a sense, conversation analysis. But the one of the key methodological issues is that you don't interpret anything that you don't see there in the text. So the text kind of like must speak for itself. Like you can quantify things, like how many times does this one person interrupt or initiate overlapping speech. So if there's only one person who always does that and nobody else, then it may indicate maybe an indication of something, but you're just you're drawing your data from the text of the transcript. So naturally occurring conversations recorded and then transcribed, and the transcription is the text that informs what you are finding. Not interpreting that, this is an overbearing person and I've known this person all my life and that's why he's always interrupting. But if you just kind of like show that this is going on, then the reader can make the inferences there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about interactional sociolinguistics, the second approach to doing discourse analysis. In interactional sociolinguistics, it's sometimes kind of like, how is this different from conversation analysis? And it's a good question. But in interactional sociolinguistics, the basis is in qualitative methodologies that you don't necessarily have to quantify how many times does a person interrupt. But that also typically is used, some quantitative methodologies. They are often used in interactional sociolinguistics to complement the qualitative methodologies. So in conversation analysis, it's a little bit more technical. The transcriptions are very detailed. You indicate every inhaled sound or inhaled voice, every laughter, every non-linguistic sound, and also indicate the linguistic sounds in great detail. Of course, it's a continuum. You can do a very, very close analysis or a less transcription or a less narrow transcription, and anything in between. But we're practicing. We will be practicing that. We will be probably doing a relatively non-narrow transcription of the minute that you record, but also pay attention to things that you wouldn't normally pay attention to, like how long was the pause, because that's also an indication of something, and if there are elongated sounds. Well, we went over that already in that when I gave you the instructions for how to write the transcript, and we'll talk more about that on next week, next Tuesday. So qualitative methodologies are the main thing that you interpret what's going on. Here it's okay to say that this person is seems to be kind of overbearing and kind of like bring some extra textual information in, whereas in conversation analysis it's done to a much lesser degree. And complement that with quantitative methodologies. In interactional sociolinguistics, we contextualize. We look at the people, what people's the stance markers that they say. Like, there are some people who are very hedgy. They use, "Oh, I'm not sure. Probably it may be so, and I'm not sure if it is so, but perhaps it could be." So, what kinds of linguistic features go together with being not direct or being not confident? So, less confident speech is indicated by these stance markers that, "Oh, I'm not sure," and so on. So that's just one example. Intercultural and cross-cultural communication has been looked at a lot in interactional sociolinguistics because it kind of lends itself to this approach that you have these people coming from different cultures, and when cultures meet, there may be cultural clashes because different cultures have different discourse strategies and a different organization of discourse even. That in some culture you do one thing, in another culture you do another thing. And then when you put these people together to interact, something may go wrong. And we're going to be looking at a couple of examples from my own research of intercultural communication. But I want to emphasize that you don't need to be looking at some people from abroad or immigrant speech or what I have been looking at, or you don't have to find someone who comes clearly from a different culture and then look at that person's interaction with someone who has been here since Mayflower. We have intercultural differences right here and now. And one example would be that males and females seem to be coming from different cultures to an extent. And when in a family you have sons and daughters, the parents tend to be, no matter how egalitarian they are and how much they want to minimize any differences in how they treat their children, you will still find some differences in how we speak to little boys and how we speak to little girls. And people have done interesting studies on this, finding that we indeed tend to react to that particular feature, even though, especially today, we are not supposed to be noticing any differences between people in any ways, but some studies have shown that we still tend to do that, remains a fact. There was an interesting study done in a pediatrician's office. Of course, this was all prearranged, and people were giving their consent to participate, except they weren't told what the researchers are looking at. So, in a pediatrician's office, you have little boys and you have little girls, and they very often, even babies or toddlers, a 1-year-old for instance, dressed a little bit differently, not necessarily, but maybe dressed a little bit differently. And what these researchers did, and this is a while back, I don't know if this kind of research would be encouraged nowadays, but anyway, it's a simple research design, and they found interesting things. So because people you know, if you ask any parents, do you speak differently to your sons versus to your daughters? And everybody's, of course we speak the same way. I remember having been really adamant about that and myself, and you know, I give my son dolls to play with, and I give my daughters little trucks and cars to play with, so I am raising them equally. But then people keep claiming this, and what do they actually do is interesting. The words don't matter, what we do in everyday situations. And so what they did in this particular experiment, they dressed little boys in fluffy pink dresses, like a 1-year-old toddler. And they were interested in the reactions of the people who joined that waiting room, doctors, pediatricians' waiting room. And what they found, everything was recorded under consent, except the research participants when told that we're interested in looking at how you speak to this little pink-dressed, fluffy, you know, very girly 1-year-old, and people did speak differently. Like, oh, sweetie, you look so cute, which they would never, ever have said to a boy. And they offered the little girl, you know, girly toys and different things for the other way around. So it was quite revealing. And this is, you know, one of the reasons why I want you also to do a little bit of hands-on discourse analysis, is because you'll find something you didn't think you know. There have been, you know, people tend to, we already talked about this when we talked about Peter Trudgill's work in England, when he found that people tend to claim that oh, I use very many like swear words and non-standard pronunciations and so on. And they were working class men who did that, or younger women. And then they found that middle class women tended to also misrepresent in how they said which forms they would be using. That differed slightly from the forms that they actually used. Some people who, there was an interesting study by Bloom and Gumpers done in the around 1970. A while back, it has become a classic in sociolinguistics. A study in Norway, because you have 2 different dialects of Norway. And there's one that is more formal, which is called bokmål, and then a more informal variety. And people were first asked, so in this particular situation, what variety would you be using? And they were all, oh, I will be using bokmål, the formal variety. And then they were actually recorded, and lo and behold, you find that they were switching between. So we have these conceptions about ourselves that are not necessarily identical to what we actually do. So anyway, all kinds of interesting things can be found when we record naturally occurring conversation, make a transcript out of it. I have to say one thing that I found myself, which was really kind of important finding. I did my dissertation on the mixing of Finnish and English of Finnish Americans, and my own children were 2 of my many research participants, and my children were like 9 and 10. My daughters were the ones that I used for this particular study, and I did not know that there was a difference in how the one who was a year older was switching languages versus the other one who was a year younger. And it was so that the older one spoke in full Finnish sentences, throwing in some English words here and there, doing intersentential code switching. Whereas the one who was a year younger, 8-year-old, she started sentences in Finnish, but she switched to English before the sentence ended. So, I hadn't noticed that. I had not noticed. I knew that they both mixed the languages, but I hadn't noticed that there was a clear difference in how they mixed the languages. And of course, what it was an indication of was that the younger one had started to lose her Finnish because she couldn't finish a sentence in Finnish, no pun intended. But the older one did that. She just threw some English words in there. And the critical difference was that 1 year of age, because the younger a child is, when they are exposed to a majority language, the more likely they are to lose their first language. And another, critical difference was, in addition to that year, what that year entails is 1 year more of input in monolingual Finnish before we immigrated. And also during that year, the older one had gone to first grade in Finland. So she was exposed to also written English. Now, that meant that I was horrified. Like, is this how vulnerable a child bilingualism really is? Because until then I was like, oh, it's so cool that they are learning English. Of course it's cool, but then the question becomes, how do we maintain their Finnish at the same time? And it was an expensive realization, because it meant that all the extra money that we had, we shoveled into plane tickets to send them for grandparents and relatives to Finland during the summers. I didn't even, for many years, I didn't have the time and money to go myself, but I sure wanted to send my daughters there so that they get this basis in a monolingual environment. So it was something. I was living with these kids, and I didn't notice that this is going on. Language loss is going on, especially with the younger one. So I promise you will probably find something interesting when you do your transcript. Okay, let's move on. Look at the third way of doing discourse analysis, and this is called critical discourse analysis. It's not a method, but it's like a world view. It's a way of viewing the world that influences how text and talk are analyzed. And there is a practical goal to find something that is problematic in the world through language. So language can reveal a lot of problems in text and in talk that are reflections of problems in the world. So this is a very social, and next chapter is about social justice, so this kind of feeds into that. So this is a very, very social approach to analyzing language, and it looks at relationships such as like domination, discrimination, power, and control. And that is, of course, it's reflected in language. How does language reflect that one person is in control? Does that person always talk more so you can quantify and show that that's actually going on? Is there discrimination? Are there certain groups of people who are not given the conversational floor as easily as another group of speakers? And you can find that in conversations. This approach can reveal some really severe problems in society that we're still working on to somehow rectify or at least try to rectify. And I'm just going to give you an example which probably everyone can relate to, about gender differences in group meetings, for instance. In meetings, sometimes you want to say something in a meeting, and then how do you manage the conversational floor to make space for yourself to get your message delivered? And I have found myself, I'm not saying that this is a serious problem, but I've spoken with other, especially women, and they feel that it's easier for men to just take the conversational floor. Have you noticed something like that happening?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, and I think for me in meetings it's even an additional problem is that I come from a culture where we tend to have longer pauses between discourse turns. When one person speaks, then we tend to. Finns tolerate more silence than Americans, Anglo-Americans. So that's an additional thing. Somebody says something and clearly finishes what he's saying, and then I'm kind of waiting a few milliseconds too long before I start talking. And there I am, I put my hand up. I'm maybe this helps that, Helena has something to say. And I noticed that, my hand was pretty much ignored, and, a lot of other people were talking. But anyway, I'm not saying that I'm a victim in this case at all, but it's just an interesting finding that I had to kind of develop strategies to do. I still find it uncomfortable to kind of take the conversational floor. I'd rather put my hand up and okay, Helena has a comment. Thank you, and here's my comment. and these are fascinating things. Okay, corpus linguistics, what is that? This is a method to aid critical discourse analysis, but it's not restricted to critical discourse analysis. Of course, you can do all kinds of studies. You can do studies of the history of English by looking at historical corpora and so on. But corpus linguistics looks at these texts that people have collected electronically, and you have all kinds of different. We have access through our library to a lot of these corpora, and you can look at those texts, and you can do electronic searches and so on. You can do these analyses where you see which words appear with other words, like collocation searches, concordancies, where which words preceded this particular word and which words came after, and you can set the collocational searches or the concordance searches so that is it 5 words before and 5 words after, or 3 words before and 3 words after, and then you find all those instances, and what we find is I think I used this example in the beginning of the class, that when we talked about collocations, that okay, so you're interested in for instance the media attitudes about immigration, say for instance, and if you keep finding immigration, illegal immigration collocating an awful lot of times, then that's something that's going on as a notion in the society, and illegal immigration is on the rise or whatever. And this is just one example, but it's revealing in a way. And then you can do quantificational studies, like how often You can count whether your findings are significant if you use the statistical methodologies and so on to show that yes, this is a significant collocation, it appears, more than at a chance level, and to what level of significance and so on. So we have now kind of like talked a little bit about these three, and I have to say that kind of understand that these are the three approaches, but it's not like they are completely isolated from each other. Sometimes they fall on this, we always talk about this continuum, that you can do critical discourse analyses, even though it seems that you're doing intercultural communication analyses. And how is that then different from conversation analyses? So they may overlap, and in practice it's sometimes difficult to say which does this particular piece of research belong to. But pretty often, one more word about critical discourse analysis. It's based on the idea that there is no objective way of looking at things, that everybody has a bias. The researchers have a bias too, and very often critical discourse analysts, they reveal their bias in the beginning. That, for instance, because we can kind of tell what the bias is. Does this come from the left, or does it come from the right, or does it come from an anti-abortion people, or the people who are, pro-choice or pro-life or so on? Is it anti-capital punishment? Is it pro-capital punishment? So, and the list can go on and on. So we kind of tend to, you start reading a news story, and relatively quickly you notice that what the bias of the person is, and it's it takes a smart audience to be aware of these biases if we want to form our own opinions and not be brainwashed in a way. So nowadays, when the news channels, they tend to be very polarized, and there also are a lot of news that cannot be really trusted. Can we trust that this really happened, or maybe this happened, but it's projected, it's told about in such a way that it seems to tell a totally different story. Then you read about it in another place, and it's a different story. So everything seems to be, a lot of things, I'm not saying everything, because one should never generalize, but a lot of the writing in the news tends to be kind of like tilted this way or that way, and then it's left up to us to find our own, what do we feel comfortable believing, and how do we view this particular instance, and that there is another way of viewing these things. And we do this with language. So discourse analysis is very interesting and important, and there are so many things that we can do with discourse analysis, whichever tilt you want to take. But back to this underlying thing of critical discourse analysis is that everybody has a bias. The researcher has a bias, and very often they reveal their bias in the very beginning. They don't try to be neutral, like in printed media. Very often it pretends to be neutral, but nothing is totally neutral, right? So I remember I did one of my early papers on the language of the capital punishment in the Huntsville item, and because every time there's an execution, yes, this is Huntsville, Texas. Every time there's an execution, there are reporters as witnesses, and the Huntsville item reporter is always has a space there. And then the next morning you can read about it in the Huntsville item about the execution. You have this execution story. And that was kind of like my way when I moved to Huntsville. It was my way of dealing with the fact that I live in the city where people are actually executed by the state. And it was something because I am anti-capital punishment. I understand people who are pro-capital punishment, and I think it's, the twain shall never meet, even though the sentiment toward executions is becoming more and more people. I mean, here it was, when I was doing my research, it was like almost 80% of Huntsvillians are pro capital punishment. So I didn't bring up that topic, for instance, in the freshman writing classes, because all of a sudden you have two parts of the class just kind of like at each other's hair, because they felt so strongly about it. And anyway, so I did that paper, and I don't think I mentioned that I am myself anti-capital punishment, but if I were to do it now, and if I were to say that this is done in the vein of critical discourse analysis, and I am showing that I come from this particular bias. Anyway, so let's move on and look at this example of from intercultural communication, and this comes from the genre of business telephone conversations. This is some early work that I did on business communications and telephone conversations. So telephone conversations have been studied quite a bit, and there is this University of Texas Conversation Library where acknowledgement to the University of Texas Conversation Library. I got these data of English business telephone conversations from there, because what I needed to do before doing intercultural telephone conversations, a comparison, because I had a hunch that there's something going on here, and I had to establish, so what is the pattern in English, American, English language telephone conversations. So this is the opening sequence. You have this very brief introduction. This Larry, then a 0.3 second pause. Hi Larry, this Red. Larry says, hey Red, how are you? Very brief pause. Red says, pretty good, how you doing? This is just like exhaling this two H's there. Larry says, oh, just wonderful. 3 millisecond, 0.3 second pause, and he goes directly into business. XC29, a little pause, and Red says, XC29, okay, you want to add the P term for, and that's it. So what we see here are three things. First, they say each other's names because they are on a telephone. It's not pre-Zoom times. The rules for Zoom are different, and it's interesting because we first kind of tried to, okay, surely Zoom is going to be just like another telephone conversation, but it's not. It's so difficult, and there are these accommodations by Zoom. Like, for instance, you can raise your hand, you can write in the chat, and so there are the accommodations that kind of like try to cater. But how do you feel about? Does it work?
I feel like unless the people are actively paying attention to the chat, it often gets ignored.
Yeah.
So unless, like, if the professor actively has it open and is like, you can put it in the chat and I will see it, it's not going to get seen, especially if they're doing like a PowerPoint.
Yes.
The raising the hand thing only works if everyone has it on gallery view. So if you've got it on speaker view, you're not going to see who's raising their hand.
That's right. That is right. So raising the hand doesn't work.
It sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't.
Yes, and then again, you know, the one who's the host can mute everybody, so you have to unmute yourself. And how many times have you been in this situation where people forget to unmute themselves and they're talking and talking and talking, and we see that their mouth is moving but we can't hear anything. So, hey, you need to unmute yourself. And it's weird. The rules are developing, and it's during this past COVID year that we've been everybody has been in this huge interactional electronic communication experiment where we're seeing that this is so different from like face-to-face classroom or a telephone conversation. So it's kind of like a conglomeration. Of course, we do chat. We do FaceTime, WhatsApp, whatever with our friends, but then and we can do Zoom with our friends, but then when you have to conduct all the meetings via Zoom, and then how do you get the floor? Because you have to remember to unmute, but are there rules when it's kind of like acceptable and so on? So it's really, really interesting. But so what we have here is the exchange of names, because people need to know who they are talking to, this Larry, this Red, hi, and then comes the greeting. So greeting is the next episode. Small, very, very short episode. Hi, hey Red, how are you? Then comes this how are you, which in American conversation, telephone conversations, is not a real question. It's just a part of that greeting. Hey Red, how are you? Pretty good, how are you doing? That's the second adjacency pair to the greeting. Pretty good, you provide the answer and you're obliged to say, how are you? How you doing? And Larry is obliged to reply to that, but we can see that this is totally pro forma, this exchange. It has to be there, but it's not, you just do it like on an autopilot, because what the reason for this call was that they were talking about whatever this XC29 is. That's what they needed to talk about, and that's what that little arrow here points up to. Now we start the business already that quickly. Here is a business conversation from another culture. This is between two Finnish businessmen. So I have the translations on every other line, and I will post this on Blackboard, so you'll have it there. So the lines are numbered here from 1 to 14. The interesting thing is on line 14, because that's the beginning of the business, which I was here interested in. But you have all this long pre-sequence to the beginning of the business. How is Asko? And Asko is the person this A is talking to. How are you? How are you, Asko? Well, nothing here. More extraordinary, more extraordinary. How about there and there? Then scroll down to line between lines 7 and 8, where you have the English translation in parentheses. Well, nothing here either. It's hot and stuffy. It's been like over 40 degrees now for a long time. Between lines 11 and 12, B answers, oh, it has been so dry over there. Here it's been, well, like a little bit cooler, something like 90. I was talking about Celsius and Fahrenheit. These are American Finnish businessmen. Yeah, B says, it's just so damn humid. All this time has been spent on an answer to the how are you sequence. which in Finnish is a real question. And there is also, I looked at quite a number of these conversations, and what I found was that it seems that it's an almost obligatory thing before you go to the business, like on line 14, well, listen, and then the business starts, to have this non-topical sequence where you talk about this and that. This is the Vedic communion, the Malinovsky's term, Vedic communion, where we are just talking about empty things, like what you talk about, when you see somebody here. How are you? How are you? I'm fine, thank you. How are you? This is also, in a way, part of that Vedic communion, kind of like empty, because it doesn't really mean anything other than a greeting, but if it's missing, then it feels weird. If you run into somebody whom you kind of know, and there is no "Hi, how are you" sequence, it feels like, oh, he must have had a bad day, or oh, he didn't notice me, or something like that. Oh, that was rude. So we get these negative reactions if something doesn't happen. But this is the Finnish pattern, that you really ask, how are you, Asko? And you kind of hedge first. Oh, there's nothing weird here, nothing extraordinary. What about there? And this "what about there," then it is the pre-sequence to that non-topical about the weather. Weather is always a good topic to talk about, right? So what I found is these data come only from 5 different conversations. They're listed up there. Is that in the Finnish conversation you have the opening, you have the close, and then you have the business. If you look at the business, there is an X under every single conversation. In a business telephone conversation, that's an obligatory part. But then, of course, the opening is also an obligatory part, unless it's also an obligatory thing to say your name in the opening, to say, who are you talking with. But there is no limited answer. If there is this greeting, there is no limited answer to how are you. There is an extended answer to how are you. And that introduces the non-topical sequence, which seems to be almost obligatory in the Finnish business conversations. Then you have the close, and what kind of a close it is. In closes, there's often this pre-close, which may be something light, like I'm gonna go and have a beer now. That would be kind of like lightening. Oh, nice talking with you. I'm gonna go and have a beer now. Or nice talking you. It's time to pick up the kids from school, or what have you. Recapitulation means that you kind of go back to the business and say a summary. Okay, I will be sending you the text in the next couple of hours. Close initiation, often something like, okay, it was nice talking with you. I think I'm going to let you go now, or something like that. We use these when we chat with people. And then comes the formal closing, which is obligatory. Notice that in all these conversations, there's the little X here in the formal closing. So this is the last thing we'll be looking at. Here are the same thing for the English and English language conversations, and you find the same big episodes: opening, non-topical, business, and close. But there are differences, and the A it has a little subscript F